App Services is a large part of Azure usage and traffic. They host millions of apps, APIs, and containerized applications predominantly. They're efficient, super easy to set up and integrate with a ton of other Azure services. A lot of the time though, they aren't used efficiently. They cost much more than they should, and most of the really amazing features are never used. I'm Lars, Azure Training Architect with A Cloud Guru, and in this talk I'll show you a bunch of ways to get 110% from your Azure App Services. I'll go through deployment slots, web jobs, Azure functions, managed identity, development tools, application insights, and well, everything in between really. So grab your popcorn and favorite llama, here we go. Let's start with clearing up a basic point of confusion that I come across all the time. The difference between app service and app service plan. Despite the terrible naming, knowing the difference is critical to using app services. In a nutshell, the app service plan is the virtual machine that runs your app service, or app services, I should say, plural, which immediately brings me to possibly the lowest hanging fruit on the app service fruit tree. You can have multiple app services on a single app service plan. In fact, you should whenever possible. All right, let me explain. So when you spin up an app service plan, you pay a monthly fee for that. And it doesn't matter if you run 1, 2, or 8, or even more services on it. It's always the same price. I've seen companies that have had a single app service plan for each app service, usually because of management reasons or some excuse. And that's what tags are for, people. This meant that companies were paying many times more than they had to. So what's the downside then to having multiple app services on a single app service plan, you might ask? All of the app services are obviously using the same resource, the app service plan. So any changes to the plan will affect all app services. If you scale up the VM or app service plan for one app service, all of the services will be affected. You need to be aware of the impact of adjusting, configuring, and changing your app service plan. And any performance issues with a single app service can have an impact on all of the other app services, but more on that later. But there's more than just app services you can run on an app service plan. At its core, it is a virtual machine, which means it's just a computer. Yes, there is some magic added to make it a platform as a service, but that also means there's more you can do. You can run your Azure functions on an app service plan. When you create a new Azure function app, instead of choosing to run it serverless, which is what the cool kids will tell you to do, you can choose an existing app service plan. Your functions will be run on that plan and it won't cost you anything extra. It'll also get rid of cold starts if configured correctly. Have you heard of web jobs? Most people haven't, to be honest. Oh, it was so long ago, it is left in the bottom drawer of the memory of broken dreams. Web jobs are like the original Azure function in a way. Just like functions, they are simple programs that are used for kind of background tasks. They run on .NET Core, and you can use Visual Studio to build them. And they run in an app service plan. There are two ways to run web jobs, continuous and triggered. The continuous variety starts immediately and is in effect an endless loop. These are very useful for immediate tasks such as triggering up a workflow for sending an email. The second type, triggered, can be either manually triggered or set on a schedule. You could use these to clear expired tickets in a database on a regular interval, for example. Web jobs are simple, fast to make, efficient to run, and free. You pay no extra to run them. Let me show you where they live. This app service is for my website, larsclint.com, and I just want to show you where the web jobs live, because sometimes some of these menus in Azure can get quite confusing. On the left here, if I scroll down, under settings, you can see that there is web jobs. So if I click on that, it'll show me any current web jobs, and for this particular website, I have one, which is named DAS, Data as a Service, and is a continuously running background process or web job. If I wanted to add another one, I could click here, but in this case, because I'm using source control and continuous integration for this particular website, it can't actually add one because it would step on the toes of the configuration. So in that case, I need to use my continuous integration and my source control to deploy a new web job
which is the way you would do it anyway, I would argue. But that's where web jobs live. If you can add one here, you add just the executable or the zip file, and then that will run a web job.
So let me surmise for your manager. The more services you can run inside an app service plan, the cheaper each will be. It adds some management and configuration overhead, but 9 times out of 10, it is worth it. Okay, enough of app service plans. The first feature of an app service I want to touch on is one of my absolute favorites, deployment slots. A lot of developers are aware of deployment slots, but few use them to their full potential.
If you aren't familiar with deployment slots, they are exactly that. App service slots that you can deploy to your live environment. The most common scenario is to have a production slot and a staging slot. You push all new features and new code to that staging slot, which you then confirm is working as expected. When all is well, you swap the two slots so deployment becomes staging and vice versa. The swap is instant and minimizes downtime as well. And then from there on, your old production is now your new staging. Each slot has its own URL, its own configuration, its own everything really. Let me show you how they work. So we're back on my website as an app service, larsclint.com, and I want to show you how to create a deployment slot. So on the left here in the menu, there's deployment slots. Click on that. And you can see you always have one at least, because you got to put your code somewhere. So currently I have one, Lars Clint, which is production. If I want to add another one, I simply click add slot. And a little menu pops up here. I got to give it a name. Now the name that you give it becomes dash your website name. So if I say this is staging, then the website name is Lars Clint dash staging. So I can then choose to clone settings. So these are the actually application settings. I can clone them or not. Normally, if it's a staging, you don't want to clone the settings because you want those to point to different databases and different data so you can test things and create things, etc. So I'm going to do not clone, and I'm going to add one, and it's now going to create a deployment slot for me. So this is an identical version of my website, apart from the settings, that lives in the same app service plan, doesn't cost me anything extra, and it means that I can now deploy to my staging website, and when that is created, when I'm happy with what is on staging, I can simply swap them. It's that simple. Been successfully created, so I close that. Now if I go into Lars Clint staging here, you can see that this behaves like a complete app service itself, because it is. This slot is just another section, I guess. It's connected to the production of that, but it has its own URL, which is there, larsclint-staging.azureWebsites.net, and that means that I can go to it directly. It is on the internet. It has a DNS entry. I can see it live publicly if you have that. Of course, you can put authentication on it if you don't want people to just go to your staging website, if you have secrets, etc. But that's essentially how it works, and everything else is here. You can get application insights, you can get authentication, authorization, like I just said, backups, all sorts. Everything that you normally have for an app service, like you can see here, everything is here for the deployment slot. It's one of my favorite features.
So far, so good. But there's both more you can use deployment slots for, as well as some pitfalls to avoid.
I'll start with A/B testing. This is the idea of giving some users a slightly different version of your product to test if it works or not. Change the color of a button, have different wording on a label, use different images, that sort of thing. When you view your deployment slots, on the right, there are some text boxes that no one ever pay any attention to. Changing those numbers refers to what percentage of traffic gets sent to that particular deployment slot. Of course, the numbers have to add up to 100. That makes sense. This is a super simple and effective way to perform A/B testing on your application or service.
Now, speaking of testing, one of the traps that many developers fall into is thinking, oh, all right, I have all these deployment slots. I'll just use one for testing the app before it goes into production. Now, most of the time, that might go okay, but then you do a load test and send 10,000 requests per second to that slot. Remember, all the deployment slots run on the same app service plan, the same VM. Yes, It might auto scale to try and keep up with the demand of your test, but suddenly all the apps on the machine are gone, including the production site. So don't attempt to carry out performance testing on the same app service plan as your production site. No, don't. No, just no. Instead, use a dedicated app service plan to host those kinds of tests and let your deployment pipeline push a copy of the new app version to that too. Yeah. Let's talk about integration between your app service and other Azure services. There are many ways to get services to talk to each other. Some standard, some put together with glue and sticky tape. Yeah, you've been there too. Common to all of these integrations is authentication and authorization. You don't want just anything or anyone to access your new smiling llama detection algorithm. I know. I've seen many interesting ways to connect app services to SQL databases, storage accounts, logic apps, and much more with questionable success, which is why Azure has managed identity. Azure Managed Identity solves that exact problem. They provide management of secrets and credentials to secure communication between different services. You set up an identity in Azure Active Directory, give that identity to an Azure resource, and you can now assign that identity to allow access to other services. Here, let me show you how.
All right, let me show you how you assign a managed identity to an app service. So again, I'm using larsclient.com, my app service. And on the left here, just a bit down here on the settings, there's identity. So if you click on that, and there are two different types of managed identity. There's system assigned, as you can see there, and there is user assigned. So system assigned, as it says here, is restricted. You get one per resource. It's tied to the lifecycle of this resource. So if I've deleted my app service, I would also delete the managed identity. If it's user assigned, which is the other one here, that means that I create an identity in Azure Active Directory, and then I assign that identity to this particular service. That means I can have the same identity for multiple services. And if I delete the service, the identity persists and I can use it for other things. So usually I go with system assigned, unless you have a good reason. You need to be very aware of this, so you don't have these kind of identities just floating around. But all you do is you click on, you save that, and are you sure you want to enable it? I click yes, and it will then assign the system assigned managed identity to my app service. And then when I go to other services on Azure, I can then say that particular identity has access to this service, and that negates all of the authentication authorization that you would normally have to write in code otherwise. It's just a great idea. Let Azure manage it for you.
I'm a developer by trade and I build applications all the time on Azure. Although I use Visual Studio Code mostly to write my code, I also use the excellent development tools available to app services.
I want to show you 3 dev tools that are super useful when developing, managing, and debugging app services on Azure. And these are the Developer Console, Kudu, which is called Advanced Tools because naming is hard, and the App Service Editor. Let's look at the dev tools. So down here on the left, there is a whole section called Development Tools. And the first one that I do want to look at is Kudu. So that's the Advanced Tools here because, yeah, who knows? So it provides a collection that says you have developer-oriented tools, and you just click go. You'll notice the URL, it has .scm sort of put in there for my website, and that is the back end of this website. So Kudu is the central nervous system sort of Microsoft Azure websites. It handles Git integration, provides API endpoints for programmatic access to app settings. This is important if you have a development pipeline with a continuous deployment. You get deployment information, files, active processes, runtime versions, webhooks, and so much more. And yes, if you're wondering, Kudu is a name of an African spiral-horned antelope, because why wouldn't it be? You can see there's all these different APIs here that you can use. Up the top, there's a menu. You can get a debug console, so you can actually open up a command prompt for this VM that my app service is running on, a diagnostic console, they call it. And in here, there's quite a neat tool. So not only do you get, of course, the command line, but you also get like a file explorer. In this case, I could either do cd site, and you can see that the above file explorer goes with it, or I could click on, the actual folder and then the command prompt. updates. So it's kind of neat. I like it. It's a good tool. But there's so many other things on here that you can explore. Now, I don't have time to go through them in this presentation, but Kudu is so important when you are developing and you are debugging and you're finding out what's happening with your machine, because it gives you access to the VM itself. You can see it here, all the system info, everything is here. So very, very cool tool. All right, next up we'll go and we'll have a look at the console. So click on console in the app service menu here, and that just gives you a console in a sandbox environment, as it says there. So you can do just about the same thing. You can see it's even defaulted to www root. So everything that you normally knows from your Linux world, you can use in the console here as well. So that's kind of neat as well. It's a very quick way to get in and just do a bit of debugging or whatever it is you need to do with the console. And of course, lastly, there's the App Service Editor. This is in preview. It has been in preview for 3 years or something, I think. But this is a code editor, a very basic code editor for your files. They're called the App Service Editor, but it is essentially like a super lightweight file editor, more or less. So you can see here, I'm running this on WordPress. Yes, you can judge me, that's fine. But as an example, the readme.html, you can go in. I could edit any of this real, just in file here. So this, I would not recommend doing this in production, but if you have to figure out why something's not working, or you have to do updates and see if that works real, or fix issues that are super, super urgent, you can do it this way. But it gives you an access to all the files that are on that server as a dev tool. But yes, be careful, don't do this in production. The usual disclaimer applies here as well. And there's a bunch of tools over here. You can run commands. You can, obviously show the output of those commands and so on. Actually, you can look at Git here as well. So now this is not under Git source control, this particular application, but you could clone it from Git as well. It's a very cool, very lightweight editor that I would recommend getting to know. Make sure that it's part of your tool for using app services.
Finally, I get to one of the most comprehensive and feature-rich services on Azure, Application Insights. Now, I can't go through all the features in this presentation, that would just be crazy talk, but let me highlight some of the major ones.
Application Insights is a feature of Azure Monitor and is aimed mostly at developers, which also becomes apparent in a second when I go through the things being monitored. Request rates, response times, and failure rates find out which pages are most popular, at what times of day, and where your users are, which performs best and worst, whether you can handle increased load, and a whole lot more. Dependency rates, response times, and failure rates find out whether external services are slowing you down. Exceptions, get some aggregated statistics or drill into the stack trace of a single one and its related requests. Both server and browser exceptions are reported. Page views and load performance. These are reported by your users' browsers. AJAX calls from web pages. You get rates, response times, and failure rates. Performance counters such as user and session count, CPU, memory, and network usage. And host diagnostics from Docker or Azure. And you can also write custom events and metrics in the client or server code. My point with rattling all this off is that if you do any kind of development of app services and you care about the performance and health of it, Application Insights is about the first thing you should set up.
Azure App Services are the backbone of millions of websites. API integrations, containerized prototypes, Azure functions, and so much more. They're an integral part of Azure application infrastructure, and they deserve to be used in the best way possible for your application. Now, if you want to learn a lot more about Azure and cloud computing, check out the many courses on A Cloud Guru. We have real hands-on labs where you get actual experience in pressing all the buttons in Azure. Yeah. And we have just added Azure Active Directory Labs 2, the first of its kind anywhere. And are you into swag? Of course you are. So check out the rest of our sponsor home here at Ignite to find out how you can get exclusive ACG merchandise. I hope you enjoyed this talk, and if you have any more questions, find me virtually here at Ignite for a chat. And yes, that is a raccoon with no pants. So see you then. Bye.